Raymond.
Okay, so you talked about how forest encroachment negatively impacts the environment, and then obviously the clear negative impacts of conservation efforts on the local people. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the reverse of that and how these people might be having a negative impact on the conservation efforts.
Yeah. So when I talk about people having the possibility of having a people-oriented conservation policy, you have to kind of grapple with the fact that these people are doing things that are not helping the environment. And in talking about this, though, one guy was talking to me about forest encroachment. Like, we're not doing it because it's fun. We're doing it because we have to do it, and we have we don't want to, but we have to do it in order to have enough money. And you also see instances where there was one incident related to me where a villager helped out a tiger poacher because he was getting paid a lot of money to do it. And so if you can help employ the people, give them new sources of money that are beneficial to the area, then you can try to curb those habits and give them incentive to be more environmentally friendly. And, hunting is the other thing I was going to talk about. In that, yeah, that still happens. They're not hunting tigers for food, they're hunting pigs for food. But there's a strong link between reduction in tiger numbers and reduction in prey numbers. So when the prey is going away because people are hunting it, your tigers have nothing to eat and tigers are dying. So all these problems could be solved with a well-implemented people-oriented conservation strategy, I believe.
What sort of employment are you thinking of giving that the people should do? Because you can't necessarily farm if it pushes on forest land. You can't hunt, like you just say.
Oddly enough, what I talked about in the tri-arc landscape is forestry and actually cutting down the forest, which is more helpful than planting because after you cut down the trees, you replant it. And so right now we see pockets of farmland, but nothing is being, vegetation is being regrown. But if you have rotating logging, then you can just build up and you keep the status quo. And again, you can also employ them in anti-poaching patrols and that sort of thing. Also, if they're educated in tiger conservation, then they could potentially get higher level jobs within the forest department. Yes?
So there's a question about language. Lots of the scheduled tribes have different languages.
And I speak English.
Well, you said the translator was speaking Hindi.
Right. So the Korku people who live in this area, for the most part, are bilingual, speaking Korku and Hindi. For the odd chance that there was a person I needed to talk to who didn't speak Hindi, we could get a villager who spoke Korku and Hindi to translate between us, but for the most part they were bilingual, and so we could speak Hindi. The other castes and tribes in the area don't speak Korku, they only speak Hindi, so it's very prevalent there. Yeah.
Why is there a picture of JD?
Thank you. What a good question. So J. was in there because I didn't have time to talk about an alternative version of indigeneity. And he's a reminder for me to do that. So this indigenous model that I was talking about is sort of a colonial model in that you have the Hindu nationalists are using a colonial model and saying that the Christians and Muslims are the colonizers of India and we need to throw them out. And that's the sort of same model we see in North America, that sort of thing. J. Levy is a supporter of a different notion of indigeneity that sort of gets around that, and he has uses a polythetic definition, meaning it's a set of characteristics, not all of which you have to have in order to be considered indigenous. One of them is prior occupancy, which relates to this sort of who was there first policy, but the others are a history of marginalization, self-definition as a people, and cultural distinctiveness, all of which we can see, especially in terms of marginalization, that kind of shows that it does apply here, but may not apply to the Hindu nationalist movement. And so it's an alternative view if we're going to talk about these people in terms of indigeneity. I would use J. Levy's model, but because I don't have, it didn't factor in a terrible amount to this, and I didn't have time to explain it, that's why. Other questions? Yeah.
Do people in India ever use the term autochthony for talking about indigeneity or people who were there first?
That's sort of what the Hindu nationalist movement is all about. They try to link up themselves with these holy places like rivers and mountains and that sort of thing, showing that this is where our legitimacy comes from. So autochthony is a Greek term meaning it's self-rule, but it's like rule from the land. And so that's what sort of the dialogue that the new nationalists are using. But again, that relies mostly on a lot of who's there first. And so yeah, that is what's being
And
used.
sometimes inventions of who's there first. So it's very similar to the way it's used, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, which
Right.
is also often as an exclusionary thing.
Right.
And then, as I have one other question, if I may, you use the term local people. What do you do when local people move? I don't know if the locals from Melghat, those separate tribes, ever go elsewhere, but then if you're studying them elsewhere, are they still local people?
Right, okay.
I
Good
struggle with the same terminology thing.
Right. That's a good question. For the most part, the core views are confined to this one region of India, and they would go outside the Tiger Reserve to either get employment or work elsewhere. But for the most part, they're kind of skeptical of outsiders, and so they kind of keep to themselves. So for the purposes of this, the term local people wasn't a problem. But if you're speaking in a larger sense, if you're looking at migrational patterns, maybe you want to use a different term. Yeah. Liz?
About ownership, you said that before the park was started, people owned the forest land. Could you say a little bit more about those rights?
Yeah, well, the person who's talking about ownership didn't necessarily mean that physically or legally owned this area, but that it was simply ours. But that's an interesting point, is that when the reserve was created, people were actually given ownership over their land. But that was in an attempt to keep them on their land and not go into the forest. So when we talk about ownership, he simply said it in terms of, if this is our forest, it was sort of a possessive, not legal terms, but, and then when the foresters come in and they say, they can use those same terms to say, well, now it's our forest, you can't go in. So, Kyle.
You said at the beginning of your talk that since Project Tiger began, tiger population has actually dropped by about 90%.
Yep.
Is that a direct result of what's happening to people here? Is there any relation between the way the Forestry Service is disenfranchising people and the reduction of the tiger population?
Well, I would say yes, there's a link, because we saw forest encroachment and how Project Tiger, in some sense, only left the option of harming the environment in order to gain access. But Project Tiger, Indian bureaucracy is very corrupt, if you don't know that. And what you see is people, so in 2005 and 2009, there were two tiger reserves that lost all of their tigers to poaching. And what we actually saw was that the reserve managers were fudging their numbers, so nobody knew this was about to happen until it happened. And they will gladly accept a bribe from a tiger poacher, and so a lot of it, it's sort of twofold, in that the corruption is an issue that, that's a much larger conversation. But yes, the sorts of strategies that they're employing have left the people with only one option, and that's to encroach on the forest. Melghat also, the Tiger Reserve, also has an inordinate number of local people. It's one of the few tiger reserves that has a multiple use area. Most just have a core and buffer. So that problem is exacerbated here.
What's been tried elsewhere in these sorts of reserves is promoting the use of what's called non-timber forestry products as a way of kind of generating financial benefit without cutting down trees.
Right. Okay. So yeah, there's a person in the village called a Bunka Baba, and he's sort of your medicinal healer. And there was a study that I came across from an Indian university that identified upwards of 300 medicinal plants used there. And so if you're thinking in terms of selling that sort of thing, yeah, that could also be a possibility. You run into problems with like pharmaceutical companies who don't want to pay you rights for those things, which we saw in Africa also happen. But yeah, that is definitely another possibility. Yes.
I was wondering if you had a chance to explore the way local people relate to and perceive tigers, and whether that has changed over a period of time. I know you were there for a limited period of time, but engaging with memory and how these projects may have shaped that relationship.
Yeah, that's a hard one because, I never saw a tiger when I was there. But the first summer I was there, the study abroad program I was on, my project was collecting oral histories from these people. And so what they were all saying is that before the tiger reserve, the forest was much thicker, and you would see a tiger on the border of the village, every couple days or weeks. And now they almost never see one. For the most part, the tigers, try to stay away from the people. Tigers, when you do see them, they're attacking your cattle, basically, which happened when I was there. So in that sense, there's a reparations thing in line, so you get compensated if your cattle is killed, but of course, the forest operator takes about half of that. Again, I can't speak a whole lot on perceptions of tigers, other than people try to avoid them as best they can, because they know that it's a 500-pound killing machine, but that would be one of. So in my paper, I suggested further study for this, and one was the relation between the people and the forest, in order to understand that relation more in depth before pursuing some sort of conservation activity.
Yeah, you talked about how the forest used to be much closer to the villages and the tigers would be showing up there. But then you also had the quote from people saying that they were concerned that if the rules were in place, then you would get more deforestation. So is the deforestation, do you see that as something that is because of the rules or in spite of them?
In spite of them, as in it happens?
Yeah.
I see it partly because of the rules, in that when you're expanding your farmland, that also means you have to increase the number of cattle you have, and cattle are raised in the forest, and you see in between villages that there is no underbrush. There's trees, but there's nothing because the cattle have just eaten it all. And so in terms of deforestation, it's also bad because everything you see in the village is a product of the forest, whether it's mud or teak trees or bamboo, that sort of thing. So plows are made of the trees in the forest, that sort of thing. So that's another problem. But in terms of it being a product of it, I think in part, yes, it is. I think also in part, still, they would always cut trees, for things, and I don't think that has drastically.
Do you think it's accelerated that, though?
It's hard to say. I don't know if it's accelerated the cutting of trees, but it's accelerated the destruction of the
You said that there's a huge power dynamic between the forest officials and the local people. You also said that they had almost uncontrolled power. In what ways is this affecting the villages?
That's a very good question, and something I expand on much more in my paper, in that it's unchecked in the sense that there's no really other oversight of them in terms of government. It is checked in that if they were to set their boundaries, the villagers will retaliate. And we've seen that the incident with the tiger poacher that I talked about, where a villager helped out a poacher, one of his associates was actually beaten to death by the forest officials because of that. And that created a huge backlash from the community, and so the forest officers kind of backed off. There's also the issue of some of the lower level forest positions are employed by local people, and they basically say they can't do their jobs because if they're penalizing people for whatever activities they're doing in the forest, they're living right next door to those people. And so basically what they do is just give warnings instead of actually stopping this activity. So it's not completely unchecked in the sense that, if you have an authoritarian regime that's just doing terribly bad things, people will rise up. But unchecked in the sense that there's not a whole lot of oversight. Any questions? Thank you all for coming.